Broadcasting on the internet airwaves from the great state of Minnesota, my name is Shaun and you're listening to The Shaun Tabatt Show. Darren, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much, man. It's good to be back.
Darren, take a few moments to introduce yourself to our listeners. I've switched up the format and the name of the show a bit, so I think some of the listeners are going to be new to you. And in addition to telling us a bit about yourself, also give us an update about some of the recent changes that you and the team have had there at Wanderlust Productions.
Yeah, so my name is Darren Wilson, and I'm a filmmaker and an author. And so basically what I do is most of my movies are documentaries where I kind of travel the world and just try to capture what God's doing all over the world and try to put them in living color, so to speak. And then, so we've got a new movie coming out that's a little bit different from anything that I've done before, which we'll talk about here. One of the really cool things is Wanderlust, my company, dated us down to Greenville, South Carolina. So we are Southerners now, which is pretty cool. Other than it being really hot all the time, it's awesome. We love it down here. So, yeah, things are just, we're popping. We're super busy. We're releasing 2 movies this year, so it's going to be a busy year.
Now, The Greatest Fight is a very different project, like you said, in comparison to some of your other films. I'd be curious to hear a bit about how you and Ken first got connected and ultimately decided to work together, because I know a lot of people must come to you and say, oh, Darren, God told me that you should make my movie.
Yeah, I get that quite a bit, which is pretty interesting. No, with Ken, I was actually I believe I was in the post-production of my second movie, Furious Love, and I was kind of like starting to ramp up pre-production for Father of Lights. And I just got a random call out of the blue one day in my studio, somebody who represented some guy named Ken Shamrock. I'd never heard of him in my life. I wasn't like a UFC fan or WWF or anything like that. So I was just like, I Googled him and I was like, well, I should probably at least call this guy back. He seems like he's kind of a big deal. So I called him back, and basically what had happened is he had seen my first movie, Finger of God, and had just loved it, was blown away by it. And he'd been approached by a lot of different Hollywood producers to kind of tell his story. He knew that if he went with somebody from Hollywood, that they'd take all the God stuff out, which is the stuff that he really cared about at that point. And so he saw my movie. He's like, well, this guy obviously isn't afraid of controversy. I mean, look at this movie that he made. And then, he definitely won't take the God stuff out. So he called me up, and I didn't want to do it at all. I was in the middle of, 2 movies. I'm like, this is the last thing I want to do. And so I just I asked the Lord, I said, Lord, you know my heart. I don't want to do this. But if you want me to, you make it really clear. But as of right now, I'm not making this movie. Had a 15-minute conversation with him and hung up the phone, and I called my wife. I was like, I have to make this film. Just something in my spirit just exploded while I was talking to him. And I was like, this is something I really have to do. So that began what I thought would be a quick movie that turned into a 6-year odyssey to finally get to the end of the Yellow Brick Road, which is where we're at now, as we're just a few days away from release. It's been a long journey, but one I'm excited to finally share with people.
Well, and for the audience like you, because a lot of my listeners we're rather bookish people or bookish crowd, give us a couple of highlights of who Ken Shamrock is. Where are some of the places people might know him from?
Yeah, so Ken was one of kind of the founding fathers of the UFC. The very first kind of big UFC event, he was one of the main attractions. He just kind of made it the big event sport that it is today. He was one of those kind of founding people. And then right in the middle of his kind of success, he took about a 4-year hiatus from that and went into the WWF and was kind of a bigwig there. He's kind of the Rock's nemesis, so to speak. So he's just always kind of been either in fake fighting or real fighting. He's just been kind of a larger-than-life personality. He's a very big name in the sport. And so, yes, that's kind of like, kind of who he is, so to speak. But he's also been a very controversial figure pretty much his entire career, which is a lot of people are really like, their minds are kind of blown when they find out that Ken Shamrock has, become a Christian. So it's one of those things where it's like people who knew him back in the day, like, really? But it's a pretty neat story.
Well, I think one of the things that comes across really beautifully between the title of The Greatest Fight, the cover art that you have where it's, a picture of Ken versus another picture of Ken. I think it really illustrates the idea that viewers are going to encounter in the film, that Ken was really fighting against himself. Talk to us about that concept of identity and how that's really at the heart of the whole film.
Yeah, when you're making a documentary, a lot of times you don't go into, at least I don't go into them with a preconceived notion of what I'm going to do. And with Ken, I had no clue, because I didn't know anything about his world. I didn't know anything really about his past. And so I was just kind of this naive kind of newbie kind of coming into this thing. And so I had to really discover, what was the story here? What kind of makes this guy tick while we were filming? And it became pretty obvious pretty quickly that Ken's biggest obstacle has always been himself. He's a guy, he literally has no filter. And so he just gets himself into trouble all the time because he'll just say whatever's on his mind. And so, that was something I really wanted to explore. But the biggest thing was, we filmed what we thought were his last 3 fights of his career. And it was not like a pretty picture. It was not a pretty scene as he's kind of getting beat by like nobodies. But at the same time, so I'm watching the crumbling of a man's career and his professional identity. But at the same time, I'm watching him starting to come alive as a child of God and starting to realize who he actually is. And so it was an interesting kind of cross narrative that was happening while I was filming. And that's kind of just where the whole idea of the greatest fight he's ever had is really against himself.
And in the film, you break it up into a few different sections, and it kind of feels like you start out and you kind of are on a high note, and then things are falling, and then you get back up on a high point at the end of the film. Any thoughts on how you break it up and those transitions you have in there?
Again, it's just one of those things where you kind of go into the editing room and like, what's the best way to tell this story? And I knew that walking with him through this kind of the narrative of his life, became pretty apparent that there was this really almost dark section of his life that it was also that like it was when he was at his lowest point. That's also when the Lord finally actually like showed him what he was up against, and that he's not fighting against flesh and blood really. And so it's just I wanted to kind of take him to his, in a sense, his metaphorical death in the story, so that he can finally come alive and be the person that God created him to be.
When viewers get to the end of the film and the credits roll, is there a core message that both you and Ken hope the viewers take away with them?
Both Ken and I, when we went into this thing, we just wanted to tell a really honest story. And I want people to walk away really understanding that Ken has been to the depths. He's experienced everything most people think that they want. He's had all the money, he's had all the fame, he's had all the women, he's had all the drugs, he's done everything, and there's just nothing there. It's empty. The only thing that has brought him any fulfillment whatsoever has been finding Jesus. And so that's really the thing that we want more than anything to be able to let people know about.
I think that's one of the things I felt was so apparent. When you get to the end of the film and you see Ken in 2014, he looks like a completely different man. Just his countenance and his character seems so different when we contrast the Ken we saw in 2010.
Yeah, he really is a totally different person now than he was when we first filmed with him. And that's one of the things I really wanted to capture. I was glad that we were able to do that, even if it was 4 years later. It was a long time to wait.
Well, looking back on the 6 years that it took to bring this project to completion, was there anything significant that you and your team learned along the way?
Other than how crazy the world of MMA is, it's been interesting for me, an interesting experience, because I was filming the bulk of this movie at the same time that I was filming Father of Lights, which are two very, very different films. On the one, I'm filming these kind of, I guess you call them spiritual giants, so to speak. And I was filming amazing works of God and, God doing the impossible. And then I go from that to film this kind of almost underbelly world of MMA fighting. And it's a totally different breed of person where in 1 second they're cussing like sailors, and then next second they're praying one of the most sincere prayers to Jesus you'll ever hear. And so I think for me, it just really kind of expanded my view of God's kingdom, expanded my view of God's grace. And so it was an interesting experience to do both of those films at the same time, because you just saw the bigness of God's heart. And so that was one of the coolest things for me to see. even in the midst of it, it was like a really weird place to exist. That's pretty much where God exists. You know, he exists in the whole gamut of human experience and all of our foibles and all of our issues and our problems and our successes. So it's really kind of a cool thing to be an eyewitness to.
Well, I think a lot of Christians would struggle to look at somebody like Ken or a film like this and even think that God might be at work in the midst of somebody like Ken in his life and the world he's a part of. Yet here we see a man that Christ has been working on for years and has transformed. And gosh, it's pretty exciting. I mean, here's this man who is respected and loved in that world. And while it's a dark world, God has put him there as a light and a witness into a place where most of the church is not ready to go.
Yeah. And you know what? You know what's really weird that I saw is it's actually, you know, I wouldn't say a majority, but a very large amount of people who are in that MMA world are actually believers. It's a very tight-knit community. It's funny, these guys, they beat each other up, and then they just turn around and they're the first people to hug each other. There's no hard feelings. It's just a sport. It's about competition. They'll pray for each other. It's a really cool, interesting, weird universe to kind of exist in. But it is cool to see, like, you know, one of the things I always told Ken, I'm like, look, dude, you are going to be able to reach people that would think I'm the biggest fraud, jerk, idiot in the world. Like the people who would never set foot in a church, they're going to listen to you. And it was interesting. We filmed Ken in a few situations, like at Teen Challenge and these kinds of group homes and stuff. And I watched these kids look up at this guy who looks like Hercules and just be like, look, I've had everything you think you want. I've had it, and there's nothing there. And I promise you, you think you're tough. I promise you, I could wipe the floor with you. You know, and these kids would just, and like, you think you're tough, trust me, you're not tough enough to do this on your own. You need Jesus. And you just see the light bulbs go off in their heads, and you see the seeds getting planted that I could never, ever plant. And so it's really, really cool to see that and to see how God kind of uses everybody for lots of different situations.
I think obviously fans of Ken are going to love the film. I would also challenge just my regular listeners to the podcast. You know, often we talk about books, and I know a lot of you really aren't into mixed martial arts, but I'd encourage you to check out the film, if anything, just to be challenged a bit in your idea of some of the places God can be working in the world. He's at work in Ken's life. He's at work in the world that Ken's a part of. So I would encourage you just to check out the film and challenge yourself and be open to the work that God is doing there. God's at work everywhere.
Yeah, and you know what's just to encourage everybody too, I'm not a fan of MMA or UFC fighting. Even after making this, it's like I can appreciate it, but I don't, you know, I'm not like a fan. I never was a fan. So I really wanted to make a story and tell a story that would reach, that even like my mother would find interesting, who hates violence. There is some violence in the film, and it's kind of hard to watch in places, but I wanted to tell an honest story that was entertaining and intriguing to people, whether or not you like fighting, because honestly, I don't either. So I thought it was an interesting film, and so I hope other people do too.
I think the other thing that's kind of fun, I hope it was fun for you at least, was just for you to be challenged to do a different type of film, because you've got a rhythm and a flow with your, what we might call your God documentaries, but this was a little out of the box from what you'd done to date, at least with your documentary films. Yeah,
it was. And that was one of the things that was also something that really intrigued me. You know, it's about sports, which I love. It definitely stretched me. And I think all good creativity comes from a place of kind of where you have to walk two steps in the dark. You don't always want to know exactly what you're doing. You want to be able to push yourself. And so this one definitely pushed and stretched me in a really good way.
Now, the last time we spoke, I think you said that Holy Ghost Reborn, which is the second part, all that extra footage that you'd recorded when you were working on the original Holy Ghost movie. So Holy Ghost Reborn, is that still slated for fall 2015? Give us an update on that.
Yes, that'll be released to the world on October 13th is the date. We'll do a kind of a mini American tour of that in August/September. And then it'll be available to everybody October 13th. And super excited about it. Everybody who's had an early glimpse of it tells us that it's the best thing we've ever created. So I'm excited to finally get that out. It's a very different film than Holy Ghost, very different feel, much more. It's kind of Holy Ghost got your attention. This one's gonna kind of rip your heart out. So this is probably my most emotional film I've ever created. So very excited to get that out to the world.
Is it going to make us cry?
Yes, yeah. We're kind of joking. We should do a marketing campaign where if you buy the film, you get a free set of tissues because you're gonna cry. I've seen it 50 times at this point, and I cry every time. So
well, Kleenex, Cottonelle, if you're listening out there, Darren would love to partner with you. Give him a call.
Yeah, right.
Well, Darren, if the listeners want to find out more about you and find out more about all of your films, where are some of the best places that they can connect with you on the web?
Well, the catch-all is our kind of company website, which is just wpfilms.com. And if you want to find out more about this movie, The Greatest Fight, it's just thegreatestfight.com. Again, you can Google Wanderlust Productions, WP Films. You're going to find us pretty much right off the bat. So you can do that. You can follow me on Facebook, Twitter, all that jazz. And so where everything's kind of interconnected. So if you find one, you'll probably find everything else.
All right. Well, I'll be sure to put links in the show notes. So just go to ShaunTabatt.com. You'll be able to click right through to all the things that we've talked about during the interview. And it's time to bring another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Again, many thanks for being part of my conversation today with Darren Wilson, talking about The Greatest Fight. To connect with Darren, you should follow him on Twitter, where he goes by the Twitter handle of @WanderDarren. And again, as he said, to find out more about all of his films, you can visit the Wanderlust Productions website, which you'll be able to find at wpfilm.com. Darren, just want to say thanks so much for sharing with us today. It's always a great pleasure to speak with you.
Thanks, Shaun. I appreciate it, man.
And that's all for this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show. If you have a question, comment, or suggestion, you can connect with me via email using show@shauntabatt.com. Be sure to follow me on Twitter, where I go by the Twitter handle @stabatt. And if you enjoy the show, head on over to iTunes and leave us a review. Until next time, this is your host, Shaun Tabatt, signing off.